There's a particular kind of man the West manufactures. Not the kind in the dime novels. Those men shoot clean, love hard, die with their boots on and a quip on their lips, and the world eulogizes them before they're cold. The West I know, the real one, smelling of alkali flat and cattle blood and things that had been buried and were trying to stay that way. That West makes a different product entirely. It makes men who confuse silence with strength, who mistake endurance for wisdom, who watch their own body failing with the detached interest of a man reading a land survey, some other man's hand turning colors no hand should ever turn, some other man's fever climbing toward the ceiling of what the body can hold, and who say, with complete conviction, with the flat calm of something geological, I'll be fine. I have pulled bullets from 47 men, set bones in 32. Watched 11 die on surfaces that weren't proper tables, in rooms that weren't proper rooms. I have heard every variation of I'll be fine that the English language and several others can produce, in every register of human desperation from whimper to bark. Elias Cord said it better than all of them. He also almost died better than all of them. Almost. The part that stays with me, the part I've written in this journal 4 separate times and crossed out 3, isn't the arm. It isn't the night the fever climbed past reasoning. It isn't even the decision he made, in the small hours when the options had collapsed down to 2 and both of them cost something that couldn't be given back. It's what he said to the boy. 4 words. 31 years of medicine. 31 years of watching people say the most important things in their lives in the most inadequate language available to them, or say nothing at all and let the silence do the work. 4 words. I have never, not before, not since, heard a human voice carry that much weight without breaking under it. This is the account of Elias Cord. Rancher. Stubborn as a limestone ridge and about as communicative. And I say this as a man who regards stubbornness as the specific vice of fools and the specific virtue of saints, with no comfortable middle ground, possibly the most unexpectedly brave person I have ever encountered, and I met him on the worst night of his life. That's the thing about the worst nights. They have a way of being the most honest. What follows is what I witnessed, what I treated, and what I cannot, even now, fully explain. From the private journal of Dr. Holt Calloway, Holt's Landing, Texas, August 1887. The boy who came for me was 14 years old and had ridden 8 miles in the dark without a lamp. I know the distance because I know this territory the way a man knows a scar, by touch, not by looking. And I know the absence of the lamp because when Tommy Alcott knocked on my door at 7:40 in the evening, there was no horse lantern visible in the yard, just the animal standing in the dark behind him, breathing steam into the August heat in a way that made no sense for August, a horse that had been pushed hard enough to sweat cold. He knocked twice. Firm. No apology in the sound. I had just wound my pocket watch, a habit I maintain each evening with the particular dedication of a man who has confused timekeeping with control, so I know the exact minute. 7:40. The last light was gone from the ridge. I opened the door and Tommy Alcott looked at me with the stillness of a child who has already made a decision he knows adults won't endorse, and has arrived past the point of caring. "Mr. Cord needs a doctor," he said. "Not please come. Not I'm sorry to bother you, sir. Just the telegram. Just the facts, per word cost, budget managed." "Is he asking for me?" I said. Tommy's jaw moved. "He told me not to come," he said. "So I came." There is a type of loyalty that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't use the word. It doesn't explain its reasoning or wait for recognition. It gets on a horse in the dark without a lamp and rides 8 miles and knocks twice and delivers its message in the flattest, most direct terms available, because it knows that the situation does not have room for sentiment, and sentiment would waste time, and time was already the problem. I have met this type of loyalty perhaps 4 times in my life. I packed the satchel of last resorts, a description of my medical bag that I arrived at somewhere around my 15th year of practice and have never been able to improve upon, and I followed Tommy Alcott out into the August dark. He set a pace that said everything he wasn't saying. Cord Ranch sat 7 miles east of Holt's Landing in the crease between 2 limestone ridges that had been standing since before the Spanish named anything and would be standing after Texas forgot it had ever been Texas. The geography meant the ranch caught morning shade and afternoon heat in equal and vindictive measure. In August, the ground out there went from baked clay red to a fine white dust so alkaline it worked its way into the lining of your lungs and stayed there like an opinion you couldn't get rid of. I had been to the ranch 3 times before. Once for a hand named Dryer, who'd tangled with a fence post and, lost the argument, left wrist in 2 pieces. Once for Tommy himself, 2 years back, a fall from the loft that cracked 2 ribs and produced a silence from the boy that impressed even me. And, once, the 3rd visit, the one I turned over in my mind the way you turn a stone over and over with your thumb without meaning to, without being able to stop, for a woman named Clara, who had been Elias Cord's wife, and who had needed from me nothing I was capable of providing. Clara Cord had died of fever in March of 1884. She was 38 years old. She had been ill for 11 days. On the 8th day, she'd asked me, with the matter-of-fact clarity that sometimes comes on people near the end, a clarity that has nothing peaceful about it, that is the opposite of peace, whether her husband was going to be all right. I said yes. I have thought about that lie many times since. Not because it was wrong. Because it was the only honest answer available to me. Whether Elias Cord was going to be all right depended entirely on how you defined all right, and I could see from the way he was standing in the doorway of that sickroom, back straight, hands loose at his sides, face arranged into something that was not expression, that his definition and mine were going to diverge significantly. He was still standing, 3 years later. Whether that constituted all right was a question I tried not to examine too closely. We arrived at the ranch at 9:15. The main house stood dark except for one lantern in the kitchen window, throwing a yellow square across the yard dirt that managed to look both welcoming and lonely simultaneously, the way that single light windows always do. The barn, 50 yards off, had both doors open, and the smell coming out of it was the working smell of a working barn, cattle, the clean sharp bite of saddle soap, plus something underneath those smells that I filed before I named it. Cold sweat. Not labor sweat. The other kind. Tommy took me to the barn. Elias Cord was standing at the far end, back to us, looking out through the slat window in the rear wall at the east pasture. He was built like something that had grown from the landscape rather than been placed on it, 6 feet and some change, wide across the back, with the particular slope to his shoulders of a man who had been bracing for impact for so long he'd forgotten there was any other way to stand. His right arm hung at his side. I noticed it the way you notice something wrong in a room, not all at once. In pieces. The way the arm didn't move when he breathed. The way the sleeve was shoved up past the elbow, not rolled, shoved, the rough push of a man who needed the fabric away from something. The way the hand at the end of the arm was. I stopped walking. The lamplight reached the hand. I stopped walking. "Mr. Cord," I said. He didn't turn. "Didn't send for you." "No," I said. "You sent a 14-year-old boy 8 miles in the dark on a horse with no lamp." That amounts to the same message. A beat. The cattle shifted. One of them exhaled through its nose with the slow authority of an animal that has decided it doesn't care what the humans are arguing about. "Arm's fine," he said. "Turn around," I said. He turned around. I have, in 31 years of frontier medicine, maintained a studied composure in the presence of injuries that would have put most people on the floor. I say this not for credit. I say it to establish that what happened next was not a failure of nerve. Elias Cord's right forearm had swollen to approximately twice its natural diameter from the wrist to just below the elbow, and the swelling had continued north of the elbow by what I estimated at 2 inches. The skin was drum-tight, high-shined, distended past the point where it looked like skin at all, and the color had moved from the normal sun-darkened brown of a man who works outside into a deep purplish red that had no business being on living tissue. At the wrist, slightly below, 2 puncture marks. Small. Neat. Already almost invisible inside the swelling. Already losing their shape to the tidal pressure of what was happening underneath. Rattlesnake. My mind ran the differential in the time it took me to exhale. Diamondback, almost certainly, given the territory and the presentation. Given the gray-brown discoloration beginning to spread from the puncture sites outward in the irregular bloom pattern I associated with tissue that had already begun to die. I set the satchel down on the nearest hay bale. I opened it. I looked at him. "When?" I said. Not a question.
A statement with a gap in it.
This morning, he said. The space between those two words was a corridor I walked down very carefully.
This morning.
It was 9:15 at night.
13 hours.
I picked up the first vial of anti-venom, one of 3 I carry, the way some men carry lucky coins, not because I trust luck but because I learned the specific horror of not having something at the one moment it was needed, and I held it up and did the arithmetic that had nothing to do with medicine.
13 hours.
The anti-venom works by binding to the venom proteins in the blood, neutralizing them, stopping the damage.
It does not reverse.
It stops the bleeding, not the bruise. The tissue at the bite site was already dead. The architecture of the hand was already compromised. The only question that mattered at 9:15 on that August night was how far the death had traveled.
Sit down, I said. Standing fine.
Sit down, Mr. Cord, I said, or I will ask the boy to make you, and we will both regret that more than you know. Something shifted in his face. The barest movement. The geological equivalent of a shrug.
He sat. I want to describe the barn accurately, because it matters.
It was not a decorative barn. It was the kind that smells like work, like life, like things that eat and breathe and produce and occasionally die in your care, and all of that smelled better to me at that moment than anything cleaner would have. The lantern hung from the center post and the draft from the open doors moved it, so the shadows were never entirely still, everything in gentle, uncertain motion.
Tommy stood near the doors. Not leaving, not advancing.
The particular suspended state of a young person waiting to find out whether the thing they'd done had been the right thing or just a thing. On the post nearest the rear window, the post cord had been standing beside when I arrived, there was a photograph.
Not framed.
Just tacked there with a single nail, one corner curling from the damp August air, a small rectangular life pressed flat against wood.
A man and a woman in front of the main house.
The man younger than the man across from me, with something open in his face that had since been closed and locked and the key misplaced.
The woman laughing. Not smiling. Laughing.
The full body kind, the kind where the weather of a person's entire interior comes outside all at once.
I looked away. There are things you have no right to see even when they're in plain sight. Tell me the reason, I said.
I was cleaning around the bite site, working the way you work when you're trying to minimize reaction from a man who's already decided not to have one, is slowly, deliberately, giving him something predictable to brace against.
And, don't tell me the cattle. Give me the real one.
His jaw set. Those are the cattle, he said.
Say it plain. North fence is down. Dryer's out with a busted collarbone. Pruitt quit last week.
He stopped. The thumb moved along the edge of his belt buckle.
Back and forth.
A slow, particular drag that I was already beginning to understand was not anxiety, it was computation. A man running his thumb across his options, feeling for the edge of each one.
Tommy's 14. He can't, he stopped again. Tommy can't what? I said. Run this place alone. I looked at the photograph. How long since you ate? I said. He blinked.
It was the question he hadn't armed himself against. You could see it land, the small recalibration of a man who had prepared his arguments for every obvious line of attack and had not considered the flanks. This morning, he said.
Before or after? The thumb on the buckle. Before.
The man had been bitten at some point this morning, had not eaten since before the bite, had worked a ranch on a swollen arm and a fever I was now estimating at 104, possibly 5 in the August Texas heat, for 13 hours, and had sent away the one person who tried to get him help.
I took the syringe. I'm not asking your permission, I said. I am telling you what I'm doing.
You can choose to fight me or you can choose to save us both the trouble.
Put it away. No.
He looked at me with the expression of a man who has just found something in the world he didn't account for, and is mid-revision. I will physically stop you, he said. With one working arm, I said, and a 105-degree fever, against a man who has been physically removing objects from people who didn't want them removed since before you had that belt buckle.
I looked at him. I would like to maintain my record. That last part was not entirely accurate. But medical confidence is itself a treatment. Sometimes the most important thing in this satchel is the certainty. He looked at the photograph. I looked at Tommy, who had moved, without my noticing, from the doorway to roughly 10 feet inside the barn, and whose face was arranged into the particular blankness of a boy trying to hold himself together in the presence of two men, one of whom he loved and one of whom he was deciding whether to trust. "Tommy," Cord said. "Sir." "Go to the house." "Sir, I'd rather, Tommy." The word was not raised. It didn't need to be raised. It was the voice of a man who had been giving direction since before the boy was born, and could load 2 syllables with the weight of an entire conversation and the expectation of compliance. Tommy went to the house. I listened to his boots cross the yard. I waited until the sound was entirely gone. Then, I said, "What are you afraid of?" "Nothing." That's not a thing a person says when they mean it. It's a thing a person says when they mean the opposite and want to skip the discussion. He was quiet. "The ranch," he said finally. "Not explaining. Just naming it." "What about it?" Another silence. This one longer, carrying more weight, the kind of silence that doesn't end because the person has nothing to say but because what they have to say is something they've never put in words and aren't sure words will hold it. "If something happens to me," he said, "this place goes to the bank." I kept my face neutral. "And, Tommy," I said. His jaw moved. "Tommy goes wherever a boy with no people goes." I looked at the photograph. At the laughing woman. At the man beside her who did not know yet what was coming, who was standing in the particular ignorance of someone whose future is still unwritten, and who was smiling in the unguarded way of a man who had not yet learned that some things do not stay. "How long have you been making yourself the load-bearing wall," I said, "for everything that would fall without you?" He ran the thumb along the buckle. "Since '79, he said. "That's just a rancher's job." I administered the first vial at 9:47. He let me. I believe he let me because he ran out of reasons not to, and stubbornness without reasons is just a wound refusing to heal, and whatever Elias Cord was, and I was still, in those first hours, only beginning to understand what that was. He was not a man content to wound himself on purpose. Or not entirely. The anti-venom went in, and I watched his face for the specific whitening around the mouth that indicates either relief or the onset of reaction. There was neither. There was only the jaw, set. The arm, held still. The thumb on the buckle, which stopped moving while I worked and, then, resumed after, a steady, private metronome. "Talk to me," I said. "Keeps the blood pressure down. Don't see why it would. Gives the nervous system something to do besides panic." He was quiet for a moment. "Ask something," he said. "Why did you stay out here?" I said. "After." I didn't say after what. I didn't need to. The barn breathed around us. The cattle shifted. The lantern moved. "Where else?" he said. Not a question. Just the answer, in its smallest possible form. At midnight, his fever dropped enough, barely enough, a degree and a half, for him to sleep. He slept sitting upright against the barn wall with his arms positioned the way a man positions arms when lying flat is something he's decided not to do. Posture is policy, consciousness is choice even when consciousness wasn't technically necessary. I let him. I sat on the hay bale and opened my journal, not the one with the medical notes, that one I write in the clean shorthand of a man cataloging damage, but the other one, the one with the soft cover that I've carried since Cincinnati, the one that has survived 3 wagon fires and 1 river crossing and whatever it is that happens to books over 30 years of hard use. I wrote for a while. Not about the arm, though the arm was what I kept looking at. Not about the fever, though I checked it twice while he slept. About the photograph on the post. About the specific quality of silence in a barn at midnight in August, with a man who had decided the cost of living was something to negotiate rather than accept, sleeping 4 feet away from me against a wooden wall. About the boy who had ridden 8 miles without a lamp. About loyalty that doesn't announce itself. I looked at the arm.
The swelling had not moved past the mark I'd made in the lamplight, a small pencil line on the inside of the elbow, my private surveyor's notation.
Not gone. Not worse. 3 vials. I counted what I had. I counted what the arm would need. I ran the arithmetic twice and got the same answer both times, and the answer was the kind that makes you sit very still for a moment and then close your journal and wind your pocket watch, even though you wound it 6 hours ago. Outside, on the ridge, a coyote made a sound like a question addressed to the dark. Nobody answered. I sat with the arithmetic.
In the morning, the decisions would sharpen.
The morning was already coming.
Morning came in the way August mornings come to that part of Texas, not gradually, not with any particular tenderness, but as a flat declaration of intent.
The dark simply ended. The light arrived.
The heat, which had not entirely surrendered overnight, woke up ahead of the sun and immediately resumed its position. I had slept perhaps 2 hours on the hay bale, which is not sleep so much as an agreement between the body and unconsciousness to coexist briefly without negotiating terms.
Cord was awake before me. He was standing at the post window again, looking out at the east pasture, which I was beginning to understand was something he did the way I wound the pocket watch, a form of checking, of confirming that the things that were supposed to be in their places were still there. Cattle grazing. Ridge in the morning light. The specific acre of ground that was his in the way nothing abstract is ever fully yours, but this ground was, in the deepest, most unglamorous way, the kind of possession that looks from the outside like stubbornness and feels from the inside like identity. He was looking at it with his left hand against the wall. His right arm was at his side. I checked the pencil mark at the elbow. The swelling had moved. Not dramatically. Not overnight explosively. A slow, purposeful northward migration of 3/4 of an inch, which in terms of the body's internal crisis management is considerable, and which in terms of the timeline I was now operating on meant that the first vial had done work but had not, on its own, done enough. I made a new mark. You slept, I said. Some, he said, which I gathered was the Cord equivalent of a full night. Fever? He touched his own forehead with the back of his left hand, a gesture so practiced it was automatic, a man long accustomed to taking his own temperature in the absence of someone who would do it for him. Less, he said. I confirmed it. 102. Down from what I'd estimated at 105 the previous night. The antivenin and the body's own response working in tandem, which was the best I could reasonably expect. Not enough. But direction. I need to administer the second vial, I said. And then, I need to look at the bite site in daylight. He nodded once. A small, contained motion, the nod of a man allocating compliance like a resource with a limited supply. I administered the second vial at 6:22 in the morning. He ate something while I worked, a biscuit that Tommy had left on a plate inside the barn door, which I noticed only when the plate was already half empty, the boy having appeared and disappeared again with the efficiency of someone who had been anticipating needs for long enough that anticipation had become automatic. He do that often? I said. Appear without being asked. Cord looked at the plate. At the barn door. Since he was 11, he said. I found Tommy in the yard beside the water trough, working a piece of tack with an oiled rag in the methodical, repetitive way of someone who was doing a physical thing in order to avoid doing a mental one. Walk with me, I said. He put the tack down without ceremony. We walked the near perimeter of the ranch, the fence line closest to the barn, which runs east for maybe 300 yards along the ridge base before turning south toward the creek. The north fence was down, as Cord had said. Not dramatically collapsed, not storm damage. A section of 20 or so feet where the posts had been pulled and the wire coiled aside and laid on the ground with the specificity of someone who intended to replace it, had started the work and had then stopped mid-task. Where was he when he got bitten? I said. Tommy stopped walking. He looked at the coiled wire. Then, at me. Here, he said. He was pulling the old posts. For the new ones. I looked at the coiled wire. At the disturbed ground, the small compressed depressions where a man's boots had stood for a long time, the marks of a post hole digger driven and withdrawn. Work begun. By himself, I said. Dryer's out, Tommy said. Pruitt quit.
So there was no one to help him.
Tommy's jaw did the complicated thing. I offered, he said.
He told me to mend the south tack instead. Said the fence would take him half a day and he'd have it done before supper.
Half a day. In August.
A man of 47, alone, pulling fence posts in the August Texas heat, in country where the rocks warm up by 10 in the morning and the rattlesnakes come out to put their bellies against those warm rocks and sun themselves in the broad unconcerned way of animals that have very few natural enemies. The snake was under one of the posts, Tommy said. He said it the way you say something you've rehearsed in your mind 400 times, the specific flat delivery of a story you've told yourself until the shock has worn off and left only the shape of the thing. I looked at the disturbed earth. He didn't come in right away, Tommy said. He kept working. Said he'd finish the section and then see to it. Said he'd finish the section. Then see to it. I stood with that for a moment. Did he finish the section? I said. Tommy looked at me. He looked at the coiled wire, the set posts, the ready earth. Yes, he said. There is a kind of stubbornness that is simply the refusal to be interrupted. A stubbornness of priority, the task first, the body second, the inconvenience of biology to be managed after the real work is done. I have met this species of stubbornness in soldiers and, in farmers and, in a few mothers, who are perhaps its most refined practitioners, and I have never known whether to admire it or to grieve it. Elias Cord had been bitten on the right hand sometime in the late morning. He had finished the fence section. He had put away the tools. He had said nothing to Tommy. He had gone to the barn. And there he had stood, looking at his cattle through the slat window, doing the calculation, the ranch, the boy, the fence, the cattle, the week's work, the bank, the cost, and come out with an answer that, to him, was not a refusal of help but a reasonable assessment of priorities. A man who had decided that staying alive was a luxury he had to justify. He does that, Tommy said, beside me. What? Works out whether he can afford things. He said it without judgment. With the understanding of someone who has been watching a particular pattern for years. Like it's a problem in arithmetic. Like pain or anything is just a number he needs to make fit. And, if it doesn't fit? Tommy picked up a small stone from the fence line and turned it in his fingers. He sets it aside, he said. And keeps working. I looked at the boy. 14 years old, with the vocabulary of someone twice that. With the particular acuity that comes from spending formative years paying very close attention to a person who doesn't explain himself. What did he do after your ribs? I said. After the loft. Tommy blinked. Made me sleep in the house, he said. For 2 weeks. Moved my things from the bunkroom himself. Didn't say why. Just did it. And, before that you'd been sleeping in the bunkroom. Since I came. I turned the information over. Since the boy arrived at 11 years old, newly orphaned, pulling behind him nothing but 2 years of road, Elias Cord had given him a place in the bunkroom. After the cracked ribs, he had moved him to the house. Said nothing. Just changed the facts. I am not a sentimental man. I want to be clear about that. I have been doing this long enough that sentiment is a layer that wears off, like good boot leather in hard country. The underneath is still there. The underneath is what keeps the foot protected, but it doesn't look like what it was when it was new. But, standing at that broken fence line in the early morning, I felt the underneath. He loves you, I said. Tommy was quiet. He'd say that's not the word, he said eventually. What would he say? Tommy's thumb was doing something on the stone in his hand. The same slow drag I'd seen on the belt buckle. Unconscious inheritance. He'd say the word is responsibility, Tommy said. We walked back to the barn at 7:30. Cord was on the south side of the building, working the latch on the rear corral gate with his left hand, which does not come naturally to a man built for right-hand work. He was managing. The latch was giving him trouble and he was giving it no acknowledgement of the trouble, just the steady, repetitive attempt of a man who has decided that giving up is not in the operational manual.
"Mr. Cord," I said. "Gate's stuck," he said. "I can see that. Probably needs the hinge replaced. Was going to do it Thursday. I need to look at the arm in daylight." He released the gate. He turned. In the full August morning light, the arm looked worse than it had by lantern light, because lantern light has the kindness of warmth in it, which softens things, and August morning light has no kindness at all. The swelling had a definiteness to it that felt final in a way that scared me, the kind of volume that skin wasn't meant to hold, a pressure from the inside that was readable even from 10 feet. The gray-brown of the necrotic tissue had spread. Not dramatically. Maybe another half-inch from the bite site, in the irregular bloom pattern of cellular death, not clean, not uniform, moving through the tissue along the blood vessel pathways like something following a map. Following a map. I made myself not calculate. Not yet. "Inside," I said. In the barn, in the morning light through the slat windows, I unwrapped the arm and looked at it with the particular attention I reserve for problems that are trying to tell me something I don't want to hear. The anti-venin was working. I could see the evidence. The hemorrhagic discoloration had stabilized from the elbow upward, which meant the systemic venom spread had been interrupted. The fever coming down meant the body's immune response was no longer entirely overwhelmed. These were the good numbers. The bite site was the bad number. The tissue around the punctures, a rough circle of perhaps 2 inches in diameter, centered on the 2 small wounds that had started everything, was dead. Not dying. Not in transition. Dead in the specific, unambiguous way that tissue goes when the venom has been there long enough to complete its work, gray-brown, sunken very slightly, beginning to separate at the margins from the surrounding living skin the way a map begins to peel at the borders. Debridement would be required. The question I was sitting with, the question I had been sitting with since midnight, since the arithmetic, was whether debridement would be sufficient. 13 hours from bite to treatment. Second vial administered 6 hours in. The necrosis was localized, for now, to the area around the punctures. For now. I have 3 categories for clinical situations. The first is this is manageable. The second is this will require difficult decisions. The third is this is what we call a close thing in the after. We were in the second category. We were looking at the door of the third. "Tell me on a scale," Cord said. I looked up. "What scale?" "1 to losing the arm." His voice was flat. Not frightened. Not brave in the performed sense. Just requesting the data. Running the arithmetic. A man who wanted the real number. I owed him the real number. "The anti-venin is working," I said. "The systemic spread appears interrupted. The fever is down, which is significant. And the bite site." I looked at the bite site. "The tissue there is necrotic," I said. "Beyond recovery. I'll need to debride it, remove the dead tissue, and that will need to happen today. The question is how far the damage goes below the surface. And if it goes deep. Then, the calculus changes." He ran the thumb along the buckle. "How far on the scale?" he said. "I don't know yet," I said. That's the honest answer. I'll know more after the debridement. I'll know more by tonight. He looked at the post. At the photograph. "What's the other option?" he said. "If the scale goes to the end." I held the clinical language for a moment, examining it, and then set it aside. "You know the other option," I said. I want to be precise about what I saw in the 2 seconds after I said that. Elias Cord looked at the photograph. He looked at it with the expression of a man running a very specific kind of internal arithmetic, not the practical kind, not the ranch and fence and cattle kind, but the other kind, the kind that adds up everything you've built against everything it cost to build it, the kind where the variables include a dead wife and a 14-year-old boy sleeping in the house instead of the bunkroom, and the sum turns out to be something you hadn't fully accounted for. Then, he looked at the arm. "Then," he said, "I need to talk to the boy." We should do the debridement first. I need to talk to the boy. Not loud. Not sharp.
The voice of a man who has just moved something from the not now column to the right now column, and who will not be renegotiated.
I called Tommy.
Tommy appeared from the yard in the time it takes a person who has been waiting just outside a door to cover 10 feet. He stood in the barn entrance with his hat in his hands, the brim turning in his fingers, and looked at Cord. "Come here," Cord said.
Tommy crossed the barn.
Cord looked at him for a long moment. This was not the look of the previous night, not assessment, not direction. This was something I can only describe as the look of a man seeing something clearly that he has been examining through gauze for a long time, and, finally, taking the gauze away. "You ride good," he said.
Tommy blinked.
"Sir?"
8 miles. Dark. No lamp.
He said it the same way he'd said the fence posts and the cattle, as fact, as data.
That's good riding. Tommy's hands on the hat brim went still.
"Yes, sir," he said.
Very quiet. Cord looked at the arm.
At the hat in the boy's hands.
At the photograph.
"Doc's going to do some work on the arm," he said.
"Might take a few hours.
I need you to move the north herd to the east pasture while he does."
"Can you do that?"
It was not phrased as a question.
But it was a question. Tommy looked at him. At the arm. At me. Back at Cord.
"Yes, sir," he said.
Cord nodded. "Good," he said.
"I did the debridement at 9 in the morning, and I will not describe it in detail because there are things that do not require narration, things that speak for themselves in the telling of the fact. I will say that Cord did not make a sound, and that not making a sound under those circumstances is an act of will so sustained and so deliberate that it deserves to be mentioned. I will say that the wound was worse below the surface than above. I will say that when I finished, I sat on the hay bale and looked at the state of things, and the state of things was the second category moving in the direction of the third.
"Well," he said. "The second vial is working on the systemic aspect," I said.
"I need to see how the site responds to the debridement over the next 12 hours.
If it stabilizes, if the necrosis doesn't advance, we have a chance of managing this conservatively. And, if it advances." I looked at the arm. I looked at the man.
"Then, we make a different decision," I said.
"Tonight." He processed this. "How different," he said. "Very different." He ran the thumb along the buckle.
"All right," he said. He said it the way you say something that has cost you the price you were afraid it would cost you, and you've paid it, and you're not going to make a scene about it.
"All right."
The two words that mean, I have run the arithmetic and I accept the sum. He slept for 3 hours in the afternoon, which he did by sitting against the barn wall and simply closing his eyes, an act of practical capitulation that I suspect was the most difficult thing he had done since the morning.
I sat with my journal. I wrote the medical notes first. Temperature, 101. Swelling, stable from elbow upward. Necrotic site post debridement, unclear. Antivenin, 2 of 3 vials administered. Then, I wrote the other notes.
Looked at the photograph a long time, which I had been doing periodically since the previous night and which I had been trying to do less ostentatiously.
The laughing woman. The man who did not know.
There was a folded paper in Cord's shirt pocket. I had noticed it when I was working on the arm. He had not said anything about it, and I had not asked, and the code of the barn was that things you didn't address weren't addressed. But I looked at it. And I thought about Tommy, riding out to the east pasture alone with the north herd, doing what he'd been asked to do, managing what he'd been given to manage.
14 years old. Entirely competent.
Entirely unaware that what was happening in the barn 8 hours and 12 hours and possibly by midnight was going to determine what the next 40 years of his life looked like.
I wound the pocket watch. Outside, the heat was absolute.
On the ridge, nothing moved.
At 3:30, I checked the bite site. The necrosis had advanced. Not by much.
1/4 of an inch, maybe less, at the inferior margin of the debrided area.
Small. Measurable. Unambiguous. A quarter of an inch was enough. I sat with it for 5 minutes, which is my practice when the arithmetic changes. 5 minutes to sit with the new number, to run it through the framework, to make sure I'm not making a decision from panic or from grief or from any of the other things that medical training tries to sand out of you and sometimes succeeds at and sometimes doesn't. The 5 minutes were what they were. The number was what it was. I looked at Cord, sleeping against the wall. At the arm. At the photograph of the laughing woman. I made the calculation that no calculation had ever made me comfortable making. Then, I sat back. Closed my journal. And waited for him to wake up. He woke at 4:15 with the specific alertness of a man whose sleep is not deep sleep, who is always monitoring something, who wakes not from rest but from the completion of a maintenance cycle. He opened his eyes. He looked at the arm. He looked at me. And he knew. Not from my face, I have, over 31 years, developed an expression that communicates approximately nothing to patients who need the news delivered in sequence rather than all at once. He knew the way you know things that you have been bracing for so long that the arrival is almost a relief. Tell me, he said. The sight advanced, I said. After the debridement. He didn't look away. How far? Far enough, I said. By tonight, if the third vial doesn't halt it entirely, and I cannot guarantee it will, the necrosis will reach the carpal bones. He absorbed this. And then, And then, the arm becomes the least of our concerns, I said. The barn was entirely quiet. The cattle were out. Tommy was out. Just the two of us and the lantern light starting up early in the lowering afternoon, the sun gone behind the west ridge, the shadows lengthening across the straw. He ran the thumb along the buckle. Once. Twice. He stopped. He looked at the photograph. I need to do something first, he said. Mr. Cord, before the last vial, he said. Before any of the rest of it. I need to do one thing. I looked at him. How long? I said. 10 minutes, he said. Maybe less. I looked at the arm. At the march of the necrosis, slow and purposeful and without negotiation. 10 minutes. Go ahead, I said. He reached into his shirt pocket. Took out the folded paper. Set it on the hay bale beside him and unfolded it with his left hand, slowly, with the care of something that had been folded a long time and needed to be opened right. I looked at the top of the page. Legal paper. The header was from a land office in Laredo. The date was from 14 months ago. I read the first 2 lines. I looked at him. He was looking at the paper. You had this already, I said. Drew it up last January, he said. After the first time dryer nearly took his hand off with the fencing tool. He said it the same way he said everything, flat, transactional, as though discussing a fence repair. Figured if something happened to me and the place went to the bank, Tommy'd end up the same way I found him. Didn't want that. But, you haven't filed it, I said. No. Why not? He looked at the paper. Kept thinking I had more time, he said. The 6 words carried something I didn't feel I had the right to name. They sat in the barn between us like the kind of thing that sounds simple and isn't. Kept thinking I had more time. Outside, the first evening crickets started up, their sound rising from the grass with the patience of things that do not hurry. I need Tommy to sign it, he said. As the recipient. Then, it's done. You could have done this at any point in the last 14 months, I said. He looked at the arm. Yes, he said. I could have. I understood then. Not entirely, not the way you understand something you've lived, but enough. The paper in the drawer, not filed, not lost, not forgotten. Present. The same way the photograph was present on the post. The same way the biscuit on the plate was present every morning and the bunkroom had become the bedroom and the 8 miles in the dark had been ridden because a boy had understood something that neither of them had said. Some things you keep in the almost because the almost is how they stay alive.
I'll get him, I said. Tommy came in from the east pasture at 5 in the afternoon with dust on his hat and the look of someone who had successfully done a difficult thing and was not going to make a production of it. He had moved the herd.
All of it. Alone.
A 14-year-old boy managing 40 head in August heat across a mile and a half of broken ridge country, and he had done it clean, and when he came back he put his horse up before he came to find us, because the horse needed tending and the horse came first.
He walked into the barn. Cord was sitting on the hay bale.
The legal paper was on the bale beside him, unfolded. The pen, a plain, working pen, the kind a man keeps in a shirt pocket for tallying cattle and writing supply lists, was laid across it.
Tommy looked at the paper. At Cord. At me. Tommy, Cord said.
Sir.
Come here. Tommy crossed the barn. He stood in front of the hay bale and looked at the paper, and I watched him read the header, the land office, the date, the first lines.
I watched the comprehension move through his face the way light moves when a cloud passes, gradual, then, all at once.
He looked up. What is this? He said.
Cord looked at the paper.
The ranch, he said. Tommy looked at him.
Sir, I need you to sign on the line at the bottom, Cord said.
Your full name. The way you write it when it needs to count.
Tommy's hands were at his sides. The hat he'd been holding when he walked in was gone, set down somewhere, I hadn't seen when.
Why? Tommy said.
Not why me or why now or are you dying, though all three of those were inside the question, sitting inside it the way the venom had sat inside the arm, waiting.
Just why?
Cord looked at the paper.
He looked at Tommy. You're the reason, he said.
4 words.
I wrote them in the journal that night, and I wrote them again the next morning, and I wrote them a third time 2 weeks later when I was back in Holt's Landing trying to explain this account to myself, and each time I wrote them I found something different in them.
Not because the words changed.
Because I did. You're the reason. Not, you're like a son to me. Not, Clara would have wanted this.
Not any of the language that sentiment furnishes to people in moments that require something real. Just the 4 plainest words available to a man who built everything he had from scratch and was now telling the person across from him that the everything had been a project with a destination all along, that the destination was this boy, that the boy had been the point since before either of them had known it.
Tommy was very still.
Then, he picked up the pen. He signed his name at the bottom of the paper, Thomas Alcott, in the careful, deliberate handwriting of someone who learned their letters from a school primer and practices when he thinks nobody's watching, and he set the pen down.
He didn't say anything.
Cord folded the paper.
Tucked it back into his shirt pocket. Left hand. Careful. Good, he said. Thank you. Tommy looked at the floor. 1 blink. Then, yes sir.
Then, he turned and walked out of the barn and I heard him go to the water trough and work the pump and I thought, that is a boy deciding how to hold something that doesn't fit in any of the containers he has yet.
I looked at Cord.
3rd vial, I said.
Yes, he said. No buckle. No arithmetic. Just yes.
I administered the 3rd and final vial at 5:37 in the evening, as the sun was going down behind the West Ridge in a way that was almost offensively beautiful, the kind of sunset that Texas produces regularly and that I have never managed to feel neutral about. We had 3 vials. We had used all 3. The arithmetic was now simply watch and see what the body does with what we've given it. I checked the necrotic site under the last good light. The advance I had measured at 3:30 was still there. The 1/4-inch margin. But it had not extended further in the 2 hours since, which was either the debridement buying time, or the second vial catching up, or the specific stubbornness of Elias Cord refusing to deteriorate on any schedule other than his own.
I marked the margin in pencil. Again. A private surveyor's notation on a man's arm.
What are we waiting for? Cord said.
12 hours, I said.
If the margin holds through midnight and doesn't advance by morning, the antivenin has done enough to stabilize the wound.
Debridement, proper dressing, rest and fever management.
Recoverable.
And, if it advances. I looked at him. Then, we talk about the other thing.
You mean you talk at me about the other thing, he said, and I try to argue, and you remind me about the one working arm and the 31 years, and eventually we do it.
I looked at him. You've been thinking about it, I said. He ran the thumb along the buckle.
Since last night, he said.
When you did the arithmetic the first time and thought I didn't see you do it. I had thought I was subtle. I was apparently not subtle. Yes, I said. That's how it would go. He nodded once.
All right, he said. He said it the same way he'd said all right before, the two words that mean I've run the numbers and I'm accepting the sum.
But there was something different in it this time. Not resignation. Not performance of resignation.
Something quieter and more final, like a door closing softly in a house after everyone's gone to bed. He had signed a paper. He had said 4 words to the boy. He had put his right arm in my hands. Whatever Elias Cord was afraid of, it was not the arm. The arm was just the thing on the table. The fear had been something else, something below the surface, the subterranean current of a man who had been running from a version of himself that couldn't hold everything together, that couldn't be the wall that caught rather than blocked, that couldn't be the reason. The arm was what the fear looked like from outside. Now the paper was signed, and the 4 words had been said, and the arm was mine to manage. He slept again at 7, genuinely this time, the sleep of a man who has finished a calculation and can stop running it. I did not sleep. 9 o'clock came and the margin held. 10 o'clock. I sat with my journal and wrote in it and stopped writing and looked at the arm and wrote again, a cycle of documentation and hope and a certain kind of waiting that I associate with the hours before significant things either do or don't happen, the particular suspension of those hours that makes them both very long and very short depending on which way the thing eventually breaks. At 10:30, Tommy appeared in the barn doorway. He had not gone to the house. He had been sitting on the fence rail outside, I realized, for the better part of 5 hours. In the dark. With the crickets and whatever thoughts a 14-year-old boy has on the night the person who was the architecture of his world lies in a barn with a necrotic arm and a fever and the possibility of the worst hanging over everything like a weather system that hasn't decided yet whether to break or pass. Can I sit in here? He said. Yes, I said. Come in. He came in and sat on the other hay bale and we sat in the quality of silence that two people can occupy when they are both watching the same thing and neither of them has anything useful to say about it. At 11:15 I checked the margin. The margin held. At 11:50. At midnight. Held. At 12:40 the fever spiked. Not the gradual climb I had been monitoring. A jump, rapid and aggressive, the body suddenly reversing the modest ground it had gained, the temperature going from 101 to 103 in the time it took me to cross the barn and put my hand to his forehead. He was awake. His eyes were open and clear in the way that high fevers can produce a terrible, false clarity, the burning off of everything peripheral, leaving only the essential. Tell me, he said. Fever spiked, I said. I need you to stay still. He was not going to stay still. I could see this in his face, in the way the jaw was set again, the way the arms were, the one arm, the left arm, positioning to push himself upright. Cord, I said. I'm all right. You are not all right, I said. You are running a 103-degree fever in the middle of the night on the 3rd day of a rattlesnake bite and you are going to stay on this floor and let me work. The cattle are asleep, I said. He stopped. Something crossed his face. So brief I almost missed it. Not humor, not quite. The geological cousin of it. He lay back. I worked. The fever management at that stage is not elegant medicine. It is cold water and waiting and the monitoring of the vital signs with a kind of sustained, focused attention that is itself exhausting, the specific exhaustion of not being able to do the thing that would fix it but being required to do all the things adjacent to the thing, all the supporting structure, while the body decides. Tommy handed me the basin without being asked.
The rag without being asked. The canteen without being asked.
He moved around the barn with the same efficiency he'd shown on the east pasture, not dramatizing, not asking, just doing what was next, what was needed, what he'd been trained by years of observation to provide.
At 1:15, I checked the arm.
The necrotic margin had moved.
1/8 of an inch. Maybe less. But, moved. I sat back on my heels. The lantern moved in the draft.
I looked at the margin, at the new pencil mark that was no longer coinciding with the old one, at the gap between them that was small and definitive.
Cord was looking at the ceiling of the barn.
"Tell me," he said.
I looked at Tommy. Tommy looked at me. "It advanced," I said.
The barn was entirely quiet.
"How much?" he said. "Not much."
But, the fever spike and the advance together, I stopped. I had been doing this for 31 years. I had learned that what you say in the minute after bad news is either everything or nothing, and you have to know which one the situation requires. This situation required something. "The third vial may still have more work to do," I said. "The fever is at its height and we won't know for another hour what direction it goes from here. If it comes down, the picture may change.
And if it doesn't come down, then we operate," I said. "Before dawn.
Before the damage reaches the bones." He absorbed this.
The thumb moved on the buckle. Stopped.
He looked at Tommy. Tommy was watching him with the look that I had by now come to understand was his baseline expression in the barn, complete attention, no performance, no filter. Just a boy watching the person who had found him on the side of the road and decided not to leave him there.
"You'll be fine," Cord said. Tommy blinked.
"Sir," he said. "The ranch," Cord said.
"It's yours. You know what needs doing. You've always known what needs doing." Tommy looked at him for a long moment.
"I'm not ready to run it alone," he said. "Yes you are," Cord said. "You've been running it for 2 years.
You just haven't had the paper."
"I'm not talking about the paper," Tommy said. His voice didn't break. It held, the way a fence holds under pressure you're not sure it was built for. Held, and, I know, Cord said.
2 words. The same weight as the 4. Just distributed differently. Tommy looked at the floor.
"I'll get the basin," he said.
He went to get the basin.
At 2 in the morning, the fever broke.
Not a spike down, not a dramatic reversal.
A slow, deliberate recession, the temperature easing back from 103 to 102 and a half to 102 and a quarter, the body finally, deciding that it had been fighting long enough on that front end, could reallocate.
I watched the temperature fall. I watched the arm. At 2:40, I checked the margin. I checked it twice.
I checked it a third time with the lamp held as close as I could manage without burning either of us.
The margin had not moved. I sat back. I am not, as I have said, a sentimental man.
I have been in this profession long enough that sentiment is a weather condition I have learned to function in without being determined by. I have maintained this composure through 47 bullet removals and 32 broken bones and 11 deaths and 1 marriage and 1 divorce and the loss of my own father in the spring of 1871 and every version of middle-of-the-night barn floor medicine that the Texas frontier had produced. I sat back on my heels and I exhaled for a long time. The body had chosen. The margin had held. But I was wrong in the way that hope is sometimes wrong, not about the outcome, but about the completeness of it. The necrotic tissue was arrested. It did not advance from that point forward. The fever came down through the following day to 100 even, then to 99, then to the normal range, as though the body were issuing a series of small, formal apologies for the previous 2 days. The debridement had taken what the venom had killed. The living tissue held. The arm, in the end, did not have to come off. Not the arm. But the hand, the right hand, was not what it had been. I told him this on the third morning, in the full light of a day that had decided to be merely hot rather than catastrophic, sitting on the hay bale that I had, by that point, developed a relationship with.
The tendons in the first 3 fingers, I said.
The venom damage was deep at the bite site. The debridement was necessary. But, the tissue underneath, I showed him what I'd found. The way the fingers moved, and the way they didn't.
You'll have grip, I said. Partial grip. Left hand dominant from now on.
He looked at his right hand.
Not at the wound.
At the hand itself. At the particular architecture of a hand that had pulled fence posts and worked cattle and done everything a working rancher's hand does for 30 years and would now do less. He moved the first finger.
It moved part way. Stopped.
He looked at it for a long moment.
Can I still hold the reins? He said.
Yes, I said.
With adjustment.
Can I work the latch on the corral gate?
Eventually, I said.
With the left hand. He looked at the post.
At the photograph.
At the laughing woman who had no idea, in the moment that photograph was taken, what the arithmetic of the years ahead was going to produce.
All right, he said. I stayed 4 more days.
Not because medicine required it entirely, though it required some of it. Because there are certain situations that you don't leave before you see the shape of what's going to happen, and this was one of those.
On the second day, Cord got up.
He went to the north fence line, to the section he'd been working when the diamondback was under the post, and he looked at it for a long time with his left hand in his pocket. Then, he went back to the barn and got the tools. I stood in the barn doorway and watched him work the fence with his left hand and his partial right, adjusting, recalibrating, finding the mechanics of a task he'd done 1,000 times in the new terms available to him. He did not ask for help. He did not accept it when Tommy offered. He did not, at any point, stop.
By evening, the fence was done.
On the 3rd day, Dreyer came back, collarbone mostly healed, moving stiffly, embarrassed about the timing, and found the north fence standing, the herd in the east pasture, and his employer in the barn doing a left-hand inventory of the tack with the methodical efficiency of a man who had simply moved the work from one column to another without losing any of it. Dreyer looked at the hand.
At Cord.
Boss, he said. Hinge on the corral gate needs replacing, Cord said.
Thursday.
Dreyer put his hat back on and went to look at the hinge on the corral gate. On the 4th day, Cord drove the legal paper to Laredo in the wagon and had it filed. He came back in the evening and put the wagon up and fed the horses and went into the main house, which he had not slept in, which I suspected he had barely entered since March of 1884.
I was waiting in the yard. He came out. I'll head back in the morning, I said. He looked at me. He ran the thumb along the buckle. What do I owe you? He said. Nothing, I said.
He looked at me with the expression of a man who knows that nothing is not the right answer and is deciding whether to press it. Tommy'll bring in a side of beef on Thursday, he said. When Dreyer goes to town.
That'll do, I said. He nodded. He looked at the ridge.
At the last light going out of it, the limestone going from orange to gray to the particular dark that is only found in places where the sky is very large and the light has a long way to fall. She would have liked you, he said.
I did not ask who. I did not need to. I imagine I would have liked her too, I said. He nodded once. He went inside. I left at sunrise on the 5th day.
Tommy was in the yard when I went to saddle up, doing the same thing he'd been doing when I first found him, working a piece of tack with an oiled rag, methodical, repetitive.
Not avoiding something this time. Just working.
He'll be all right, I said.
Tommy kept working the rag. I know, he said. The hand will improve somewhat. I'll come back in a month to assess. I know. I put my foot in the stirrup. You signed your full name, I said. On the document.
Thomas R. Alcott.
He looked up.
Yes, sir, he said.
What does the R stand for?
He looked at the tack in his hands.
A small pause. Nothing, he said. I made it up.
For the document.
Thought I needed a middle name if it was going to be legal. I looked at him. At this boy who had ridden 8 miles in the dark without a lamp, who had moved 40 head alone, who had handed me the basin and the rag and the canteen without being asked, who had signed his name with a made-up middle initial on a legal document that gave him the only home he'd had since he was 9 years old.
Thomas R. Alcott, I said.
Yes, sir. Good name, I said. He went back to the tack. I wrote out.
I wound my pocket watch somewhere past the first ridge. I thought about what it costs a man to stay alive when he has decided the cost needs justifying. I thought about the 4 words and, the 2 words and, the made-up middle initial and, the photograph on the post that Cord had never taken down, never moved, never explained. I thought about the fence that was done by evening. About the hand that would grip, partially, and adjust. About a boy with a deed and, a horse and, an oiled rag and, a name he gave himself. I did not write any of this in the medical notes. The medical notes say, patient recovered. Partial loss of function in digits 1 to 3, right hand. Follow-up recommended. That is the version that goes in the record. This version, the one you're reading, goes in the other journal. The soft cover one. The one that has survived 3 wagon fires and 1 river crossing and whatever it is that happens to books over 30 years of hard use. I wind the pocket watch each evening. I keep accurate time. It is, I have concluded, not entirely a form of therapy. But, it is not entirely not.